Acts chapter 15, where the Paul and Barnabas, you remember the whole thing, had been sent by the church of Syrian Antioch to Jerusalem because of the what is called the first heresy of the church. And you don't have to be a church historian to be able to understand what the first heresy is. Well, the first heresy, and heresy, remember, it gets used in a lot of different ways, but the actual meaning of heresy is a departure from the truth. Well, I don't know that I can say these are evil Jewish Christians. Maybe they were well intentioned, but they were misdirected. They had pretty dramatic misunderstanding about God's grace and how a person is to be saved by God's grace. Well, they had said if a Gentile wants to become a Christian, they're going to have to be circumcised and observe the law. James, who is pretty clearly the spokesperson, the spokesman. I don't know whether I'd call him the president of the elders. I don't think that was they didn't think about presidents. They didn't even have presidents. But I think it was the leader. And he said, after Paul and Barnabas had described their experience, he realized this was a fulfillment of prophecy. And in verse 19, he says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." Now, there are people who resent, I know this because I had the firsthand experience of it, but that there are people who resent churches whose primary missional target are unsaved people, and they look for them. And when they find them, they do what they can to bring them to God, because they say, well, you've lowered all the standards. You can't preach the real gospel, and these people just come on in the way they are. Well, I disagree. I have the experience. My personal experience is, no, that's not really the truth. And James points at that when he says, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. And we're pretty much, all of us today are Gentiles. And those who are turning to God within our churches, sometimes I think we feel like we've got to, and our motive is we want to honor and please God, but we feel like one of the things we have to do is we have to set limits here. Another word for that is we got to make some rules, and you got to chin up to these rules, or else it's not going to work. Well, in verse 20, instead, he says, we should write to them, telling them, and then he gives some both very practical and useful in terms of health, and useful in terms of witness. Okay, first of all, tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols. This was big and very practical, because in the pagan temple, the worship involved sacrifice of animals. And then, as weird as it sounds to us, then that the meat that was not consumed in the ritual, the pagan ritual, it went out to the meat market. And sometimes, not in the same way I would or you would do it, where I'd probably hang a sign and go, 30% discount, authentic meat from the temple of so and so. But it was known. And Paul said, or James says, abstain from food polluted by idols. Now, this was a matter of their witness. All right. From the meat of strangled animals and from blood. Oh, wait, I left one out. From sexual immorality. Now, there are two aspects, and they both have to do with health. One is physical health, the other is spiritual health. I mean, it ought to just, boom, be there instantly for every Christian to realize that you can't have an authentic witness for Christ while being sexually immoral. Well, yeah, okay. In our culture, it is displayed differently in this first century culture. What we call immorality, what we call infidelity, what we would call fornication, was very common. Excuse me. As a matter of fact, it was part of the worship of these pagan temples. We don't have pagan temples, but boy, are the distractions and temptations in our world are no less of a problem than they would have been in first century. So it's easy to hop up, for me, it's easy to hop up and down on sexual immorality. It won't work. It's bad. It's evil. Don't do that. You already realize that. When you take sexual immorality seriously, you begin, I think quickly, you begin with the fornication and infidelity, with, sex with someone you're not married to. But if you travel that wavelength back, that's the outcome of deceitful thinking for a Christian. There's a lot to that. I'm not going to burn a lot of time jumping up and down on it. I will say this much. When we are tempted with sexual immorality, that's not sin. But when we permit ourselves to kind of think about it and roll it over in our mind, that's not yet sin, but it opens the door to sin. Well, okay. From food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, that's the second thing. And then the third thing, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. See, it's not much of an issue for us, because most of us don't go out and kill our own meat. We go to the store and we buy it. But back in the first century, many people procured their meat by killing it themselves. And strangled animals, unbled animals, reduced the processing time right? But the problem was the blood of animals carries antibodies, and it also carries bacteria and all kinds of bad stuff. And in the first century, well, that was like inviting a disease into your body, and they had no forms even of antibiotics. So God, this is from the law, Jewish law. All three of these things are from the Jewish law, but this one is much more medicinal than the other two. So, and all right, they needed to be properly butchered and bled. All right, well, verse 21. Here's why. For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogue on every Sabbath. So I think what Peter was saying is this in the Jewish community was very common knowledge. And most at least, Gentiles would have heard about it, been exposed to it. It's not just that James was saying, well, this is our tradition. Everybody knows our tradition. They need to abide by it. No. He is saying this is not some secret, brand new idea. These three things are part of what have been at the heart of our faith before Jesus, and now after Jesus. These three practices are for our benefit and our spiritual, emotional, and physical health. Okay, so in verse 22, then the apostles and elders with the whole church decided to choose some of their own men and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They chose, this is a very interesting thing for us, but wouldn't have been that interesting to them. They chose Barnabas, called Barsabbas. Now, who did I say? Judas, called Barsabbas. When we hear the word Judas, we immediately think of the betrayer. But Judas was a really common name. And I think they called him Barsabbas maybe so that there would be a little distance between him and this idea of Judas. I don't know. And Silas. Now, note Silas. He's going to show up later. Men who were leaders among the believers. That's interesting to me. I wonder what would have made them leaders. Here's my assessment. There are a few things that make people leaders. And one of the big things is people follow them. I think it was E.V. Hill, a preacher, African-American preacher, very powerful preacher, and a wonderful thinker, said, a lot of people think they're leaders, but unless people are following you, you're just taking a walk. I've known times in my life when I wanted to be a leader so bad, but I was just taking a walk. These two people, Barsabbas and Silas, they were not just taking a walk. They were leaders because people were following them. Why? All right, this is my estimation. One is they demonstrated integrity and character and competence, as well as confidence. And that makes people attractive as leaders. And the other is they didn't back down from leadership problems and issues. All right, time's up. Got to close. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.